Hello friends, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink. Meant to have this video up yesterday. I had technical difficulties like you wouldn't believe, as in like nearly had to get a new laptop. However, crisis averted, back on track hopefully. For today's cards, I'm using the Simon Says Stamp Slimline Scene Builder Christmas set. I think this came out in September, like for Stamptember. And I've had it like sitting in my pile of must-use for Christmas, so finally pulled it out. And I am doing something that I've shown on several other videos. I've shown stamping with Oxides many times, but I've also shown this kind of random little technique when it comes to very solid stamps, like the silhouette ones I remember doing a few months ago with Oxides. So basically, I have this big stamp, this set, it's a slimline stamp, so the stamp is large. And it's very solid. Like it has the little, like we'll call them holes. Little holes in the design for the snow. But it is a very solid stamp. And regardless of what type of ink you were wanting to use with this, whether it be, here I'm using Oxides, but like pigment inks, dye inks, etc. When it comes to very large solid stamps, sometimes it takes, multiple stamp inks, etc. to get a more covered image. It doesn't need to be perfect. But, sometimes it's just, you got to work at it a bit. And this is where a stamp positioner like the MISTI comes in super handy. But another thing I wanted to do with this was not only was I going to use the Oxide inks, but I wanted to do this blended gradient because, hello, it's a big stamp and there's space. And you guys know I like the sky blends. So that's what I'm doing. And the thing I really, really like with the Oxides is I have my ink blending tools that are fully saturated with ink. I did a video last year, whenever it was, showing how I store my ink foams for the Oxides only because I don't have handles for every color. So I do not wash my foams ever. Like, no, it's not worth it. You can buy packs of the replacement foams that are like 20 in them. So it only takes like 3 packs to have all the colors. Anywho, the foams are fully saturated. That makes a huge difference. 1, it makes it way easier to ink blend, but 2, it works really good for this. So all I did was I was inking up the stamp with my Oxide inks. This would also work really amazing with any pigment ink. Dye inks would be a little more iffy, like a brayer would work with dye inks. But anyway, specifically this. I'm inking up the stamp with those inks, and then I'm using the blending foams in between the colors to create that softer transition so that the colors blend on the stamp. And because the foams are saturated with ink, they're not pulling up ink from the stamp, if that makes sense. If I was using brand new blending foams and I wasn't putting any ink and I was just touching them to the stamp, they would pull ink away from the stamp because the foam would want to be absorbing the ink. Whereas these foams are heavily saturated because I've been using them in previous, recent videos, blending backgrounds and stuff. So they're saturated. Plus I'm mushing them into the ink pads to pick up more ink. And that's how I get that gorgeous gradient. And because my foams are so full of ink, I can literally stamp with just the foams. So you can see I'm I'm applying ink to the stamp with just the blending foams and not the stamp pads themselves. I did this just as my last little layer, just to kind of fill in a little bit of the gaps. I'm not too concerned about it. It doesn't need to be perfect, but it just gives it that little extra something. And then you get that blend all on the stamp, all on the paper. And yes, I'm using Neenah Desert Storm cardstock for this because I love Neenah Desert Storm and Distress Oxide inks. So I did this 3 times because why not? I didn't clean the stamp in between all of that. I just kept inking it up with 3 inks, which were, I always linked everything, but I used the Speckled Egg, which is one of the new colors of Oxides. And then I used Faded Jeans and Chip Sapphire. Love. This step is optional, but I couldn't not do it because I didn't want brown snow. I still wanted to use the Neenah Desert Storm because I love the look of the Oxides. Plus I want the border around the edge to be the Desert Storm when I die cut these. But I wanted to keep the snow more white. So I'm using my Spellbinders Snow Queen. These are paint pens and it comes in a pack of 4 and 2 of them are like a gunmetal color and then 2 are white. So I'm using the white paint pens and I'm just filling in all those dots with these paint pens, which takes no time at all. So they're not perfect either, since I'm filling them in this way. They're, uneven in that, but that also kind of adds to it, and I like that. And then I wasn't going to do this, but you guys know that, Christmas cards and white splatter. Like, it's nearly impossible for me to not. Plus, I'm glad I did it. I wasn't gonna, but now I'm really glad I did, because I added splatter with Picket Fence Distress Paint, and I put it on the edge of my, just my little plastic paint palette here. And then I'm just flicking my paintbrush, you know, against the edge of the palette. So it's just creating that finer splatter. And I love that, because I have the finer splatter that, you know, for the snow, but then I also have the larger dots that I created with the paint pens, and it just all kind of came together to create this snowy background, and it just made me happy. So I made a big old mess doing this, of course. Again, with Picket Fence Distress Paint, clean off your tools as soon as you're done. I wash up my brush. I just use cheap brushes. I have my little Nouveau brush set that I've been showing for however long, a couple years now. I use those, and I immediately wash my brush out as soon as I'm done, because just any acrylic paint, if you let it dry on your brush, you've ruined your brush. So I wipe off my, you know, little palette, clean up my brush, and I'm good to go. So I splattered on my backgrounds. I've let these completely dry, and then I still had space on the bottom of these, so I just used that rather than get more pieces of the Desert Storm cardstock. And I used my anti-static powder tool there. And then I'm just stamping the like bottom portion, like the snow portion from the stamp set, onto the cardstock with clear embossing ink. That's why I used the anti-static powder tool, because I didn't want any of the embossing powder clinging where it doesn't belong. And that's also why I chose the Desert Storm cardstock, because I wanted to white heat emboss these bottom parts, and I wanted them to stand out. And you could use just regular white embossing powder, but I was going through my drawer of embossing powders, and I had this Hero Arts white puff embossing powder. This stuff is fun. I can't even remember when I bought this. It's still available, but I bought this forever ago, and probably for this exact sort of a purpose, but then I forgot about it. So I'm stamping all the images, coating them with this white puff embossing powder, and then I'll melt this with my heat tool. And this embossing powder, when you melt it, it's kind of similar to the WOW Clear Matte Dull, in the sense that, you know, it doesn't melt shiny. It melts more opaque or like matte, but then it doesn't puff up like a lot, but yeah, it's just a neat emboss powder, and it's nice for snow. So it doesn't get super dimensional and puffy like, is it Puffy Accents? What is that stuff called? Liquid applique that we used to use back in the day, that we were obsessed with like 12 years ago, or however many years ago it was. I haven't used liquid applique in years, but anywho, it doesn't puff up at all like liquid applique does. It just melts and just has a puffy appearance to it, is the easiest way to explain it. So after I did all my parts, I am die cutting them with the coordinating wafer dies. So it just gives me that little bit of a border from that Desert Storm that I just really like. And then for the trees, I'm using distressed watercolor paper. White cardstock would have been just fine. I just happen to have my distressed watercolor paper literally sitting at my elbow, so I grabbed them, but Simon's white cardstock would have been perfect for this. But I cut down one of the pieces for the larger trees, and then I cut down another piece for the smaller tree in this set. And I am going to ink blend the new Rustic Wilderness Distress Oxide ink. I wanted a bit of a gradient. I could have done just green cardstock, but I just, one, love this color for Christmas cards. And two, like, I wanted a gradient. I wanted it slightly darker at the bottom and then fading up a little bit towards the top. So blending this on, same thing, ink blending foam that's already saturated with that green ink. And then starting at the bottom, blending it. I'm just working on my mini waffle flower water medium mat because I like how it clings to the cardstock, so I don't have to put in as much effort holding it. And then I'm going to do this to all those pieces. So to this larger piece that I'll do the smaller trees, and then all of the pieces for the larger trees, and exact same thing. Start at the bottom, blend the color upwards. And then once I have the color on, I'm going to stamp the trees. And again, there was a method to my madness with everything for these cards. Like, I put a ridiculous amount of thought into it because I had this very specific idea in my head. And this is everything I did to achieve that very specific idea. From the background, the trees, everything had a reason. So I ink blended the background first, and then I'm stamping the trees with VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. Stamping them second because I was working with a Oxide ink. What I could have done is I could have stamped the trees, let them dry, and then blended over it with the Rustic Wilderness Distress ink, because Distress ink is transparent, whereas the Oxide ink is not. So if I'd stamped the trees first and then blended that Oxide ink, the ink would have covered up the black of these trees. And I didn't want to heat emboss the trees because I'm going to do heat embossing in a minute. Again, like I said, there was many reasons to why I'm doing things in the order I was doing them. So I'm stamping everything. That white little unit, if you haven't seen my recent videos, that I'm using when stamping with my MISTI, that's just a whiteboard eraser. It just helps. Like, I've been using a microfiber cloth, or I'll use my sleeve just to make it something to glide over the lid a bit more so I don't have to press as much with my fingers. And the whiteboard eraser is really nice. I like it. So that's what it was. So anywho, after the trees are stamped, I had to let everything dry. I actually hit it with my heat tool because I'd used Oxide ink and VersaFine Clair ink, which both are slow drying inks. So I wanted these completely dry. Made sure they were, heavily coated them with the anti-static powder. Made sure that was working. And then I'm stamping the little speckle stamps that are made for the trees. You could like white heat emboss them. You could stamp them in gold. You know, you could make them as ornaments or like snow. It's personal preference. I was thinking ornaments. So I'm stamping it with clear embossing ink. And then I'm using a purple embossing powder. Again, I was going through my heat embossing drawer. I literally have a drawer full of containers of embossing powder. And I came across this purple one. So I don't know if this one's still available, but I'll link to a couple of very similar ones, like similar color. And after I would stamp that image, I'd coat it with the purple embossing powder. And I'm doing all this at once, so I would just set each tree aside until they were all stamped and covered with the embossing powder. And I'm going to melt that with my heat tool. So now I've got that pretty purple, like ornaments basically, on all of these trees. So once these are all completely melted, I am going to use the coordinating wafer dies for these and die cut all of them. So that everything melted, I'll funnel that embossing powder back into the container, put the lid on it so I don't knock it over and get embossing powder everywhere. And then once those are all melted in wafer dies, and then run them through my die cut machine. And then again, I could have stuck all these in my splat box and just splattered them. It would have been quick. This didn't take very long either though. But I like the control of these paint pens because I kind of wanted to somewhat avoid all those little purple dots, hence me not splattering them. I put a few of the white dots over top of the ornaments to, you know, make it more realistic in a sense. But I liked the control of the paint pens. That way I can add my little dots, plus I could add the different sizes because they obviously wouldn't not have some snow falling around them. So I just went along and added just the different sizes of dots with those paint pens so that just kind of completed all of my little trees. And just went along and used just more pressure and less pressure to get larger and smaller dots, and then using the two pens because one has a larger nib and one has a much smaller nib. So again, I like these, and I like these because they're quick. There's no way I would do this with a gel pen. I don't have the patience for that. I have the admiration for the people that can do like entire backgrounds of snow with a gel pen. Sandy Alnock, I think, is one of them. Major respect for that. I literally do not have the patience. But this was quick and easy. So after I was done all of that, everything's dry, everything's good to go. So now it's time to start assembling. So I die cut more white cardstock using one of Simon's Slimline nested rectangles wafer dies. And that's what I'm going to mat this background onto. And again, you could save a fair bit of time. You could just stamp that image onto the white cardstock, you know, and skip having to fill it in with the white paint pen and everything. But I wanted that little bit, it's small, but I wanted that little bit of a border with the Desert Storm. And I also just love the look of the slightly muted look of the colors you get of Oxides on Desert Storm. So personal preference. That is a way to make it much simpler, especially if you wanted to make a bunch at once and not be fiddling with all the splatter and the things that I personally love. So I adhered that down, and then I figured out how I wanted to place my trees. And then once I was happy with that, I'm going to adhere the large tree and the like snowy portion to the bottom. And then off camera, I had stamped and white heat embossed sentiments from the Slimline Scene Builder Christmas set. That's another reason why I just like fell in love with the set, 'cause there's a bunch of sentiments that you can kind of mix and match and build if you want. So that's what I'd done. I just stamped and heat embossed several of them so that the front of the cards say, "Have yourself a Merry Christmas." And then on the inside of the cards, and my card bases are 3.5 inch by 8.5 inch Slimline cards made from more Desert Storm cardstock. And then I stamped the trees with that VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. And then I'm going to add a couple more of the sentiment strips that I had heat embossed onto the inside of the card. So the insides say holiday greetings and a happy new year. So once I got that adhered, I'm going to adhere the card front to the card base. And as always, you could stop here, but I'm going to add bling. I was going to leave it because I was like, I got the splatter and the color and everything worked. But I couldn't not. And also because I came across, I had a package of these Blue Moon sequin mix from Simon. And it was just meant to be. The colors are perfect for these cards. So I used some of those. And I also used some Studio Claudia iridescent tiny bubbles. The tiny, tiny little ones that I've used in multiple videos. As well as the iridescent ice flakes that always have to make an appearance on some of my Christmas cards. So I kind of sprinkled these rather liberally throughout all of these cards, just mixing it up with the sequins and the confetti and the little iridescent bubbles and the ice flakes. And once I was happy with where I had everything, I'm just going to adhere those into place with little dabs of craft tacky glue and then go on and do the other cards off camera so that we're not sitting here watching me glue down sequins all day. So once I've got those adhered into place, I'm also going to pair these cards with I think they're called grocery bag. I'll have a link to the envelopes that I show in the pictures at the end of the video. So once everything's adhered, let the glue dry, these cards are complete. You can see kind of the bling and the splatter, and just, these were fun. So as always, there will be a link below the video to my blog post. I will have a supply list. I'll link to all the supplies I used, so you can check that out in the description box below the video if you are interested. Thank you all so much for watching, for subscribing, thumbs upping, commenting, all of it. I really appreciate it. And I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye!